The letter had been brief and businesslike, the kind a sheriff dashed off when he didn't care to waste ink. John Mercer had unfolded it over a chipped table in the saloon, scanning the lines that told him what he already suspected: escort work. A girl needed taking west, through the high passes where stagecoaches often disappeared and men with pistols grew bold. John wasn't much for company, but work was work, and coin was coin. He tucked the letter into his coat and finished his whiskey without another thought, though somewhere in his chest, a faint unease stirred. Escort jobs had a way of turning sideways. She was waiting for him at dawn by the station. The train whistle had only just faded when he saw her, a slight figure standing straighter than most men twice her size, a carpetbag clutched in one hand and her bonnet tilted low. When he approached, she turned her face toward him, and he caught a glimpse of clear blue eyes that startled him with their steadiness. She was younger than he expected, though not fragile. Something in the set of her jaw told him she'd weathered storms already. "You're Mercer?" she asked, her tone clipped. He tipped his hat, studying her. "That's me. You must be Clara." Her lips pressed thin, the barest shadow of a smile flickering and vanishing. "I don't need a guard." John almost smiled himself, though it was more a tug at the corner of his mouth. "Then I don't need pay." He let the words sit there, easy and dry, though the revolver at his hip glinted in the morning light, a reminder that he wasn't there by accident. The driver loaded her bag into the wagon they'd take for the first stretch of the journey, and Clara climbed in without help. John followed, sitting opposite her. She folded her hands in her lap, back straight, chin up. Not meek, not shy, just careful. He respected that. He'd seen too many who either broke under hardship or railed against it foolishly. Clara looked like the sort who endured. The first day passed in silence but for the creak of wheels and the steady plod of hooves. John kept his eyes on the road, watching for dust clouds that might mean riders, listening for the telltale thump of hooves echoing off canyon walls. Clara kept her eyes on the horizon, her face unreadable beneath her bonnet. When they made camp that night by a shallow creek, John gathered wood while she unpacked bread and dried meat. They ate without much talk, the fire popping between them. It wasn't until the second day, when the wagon rattled over a rough ridge and she nearly bit her tongue, that she spoke more than a word. "How many times have you done this?" she asked, voice steady but curious. "Enough." He kept his eyes on the trail. "And you're always paid to do it?" "That's the idea." She was quiet a moment. Then, "I didn't ask for you." John glanced at her finally, meeting her eyes. There was no hostility in the words, just truth. "I reckon most folks don't ask for trouble, either," he said. "But it finds them anyway." Her mouth twitched at that, almost amused, though she quickly looked away. By the third day, the silence had eased. She began asking questions, not prying, just curious. Had he always lived in the West? Did he believe men were born mean, or did the land make them that way? What did he think of freedom? Did it belong to those who claimed it, or was it something no one truly had? Her questions surprised him, sharp and thoughtful. Most women he'd met on the trail talked of home, of dresses, of children waiting somewhere. Clara spoke of ideas, of wanting more than a life tethered by her uncle's rules. John found himself listening more than speaking, and when he did answer, she listened with a quiet that felt different from politeness. She listened as though his words mattered. He hadn't felt that in years. Nights by the fire grew less stiff. He caught her laughing once when he burned the beams, and though the sound was brief, it caught him off guard. It had been so long since he'd heard anything like it. He told her of a time he'd broken 3 ribs falling from a bronco, and she leaned forward, eyes bright, urging him on as though he were spinning the finest tale. In return, she told him how her mother had died when she was small, how her uncle believed himself master of her fate, how this journey west was meant to end with her in his keeping. "But I won't let him decide for me," she said, her voice quiet but fierce. Each mile deepened something John hadn't expected. He told himself it was just a job, just duty. He was hired to guard her, nothing more. But when her hair slipped loose from her bonnet one windy evening and he caught a glimpse of her face softened by firelight, something shifted inside him. The line between duty and something deeper blurred. It wasn't until the canyon that he understood how far he had already crossed it. They were 2 weeks into the journey when John spotted dust rising behind them. He reined in, eyes narrowing. "Riders," he muttered. He counted 5, maybe 6. Too many to be friendly. Clara stiffened. "Are they following us?" "Close enough." He drew his revolver, the weight of it familiar in his hand. "Stay low." The riders closed in fast, rifles glinting in the late sun. Their leader grinned as he raised a hand. "Easy there, friend." Just after a little company, John rode forward, placing himself squarely between Clara and the gang. His voice came out like gravel. "Companies taken." The standoff stretched taut. John's heart hammered, but not for himself. The thought of harm reaching her sent a heat through his chest sharper than fear. He'd drawn on men before, stared death in the face more times than he cared to count. But this time, the stakes felt different. It wasn't duty pulling the trigger if it came to that, it was something deeper, something he hadn't let himself name yet. The riders eventually thought better of it, spitting curses and wheeling away, but John kept his gun steady until they were specks on the horizon. Only then did he lower it, glancing back at Clara. She was pale, her hands gripping the seat, but her eyes met his, wide and unflinching. "You'd have stood against them all," she whispered. "For you," he answered without thinking. And the truth of it rang through him like a bell. That night, as the fire flickered and coyotes yipped in the distance, John knew the truth he'd been trying to push aside. He had been hired to escort her, but with every mile, every question, every spark of laughter, he had already begun following her into something far greater. Something he could not, even if he wanted to, escape. The town where their journey ended was not much to look at, a main street of rough-hewn buildings, dust swirling with every passing wagon, and the smell of horses thick in the air. Yet to Clara, it was more than just another stop on the trail. It was supposed to be the end of her road, the place where her uncle waited, ready to reclaim her as if she were property and not her own woman. John rode beside her in silence as they entered, the reins steady in his hands, but his eyes never stopped scanning the street. He was used to endings like this, the kind where men parted ways and never looked back. But the weight pressing on his chest told him this time would not be so simple. They pulled up in front of the boarding house, its porch sagging under the weight of years. Clara climbed down first, carpetbag in hand, her back straight as if bracing herself for a fight. John dismounted slower, his gaze lingering on her. She turned to him, lips parting as though she wanted to say something, but then a shadow fell across the steps. A man in a fine waistcoat stepped out, his face sharp and smug, the kind of face John had learned not to trust. "Clara," the man said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "So the runaway returns." Her fingers tightened around the handle of her bag, but her chin did not lower. "I didn't run," she said, her voice even. "I left." John caught the flicker of anger in the man's eyes. The uncle wasn't used to being contradicted. He stepped closer, ignoring John entirely, as though the man standing at Clara's side were no more than dust. "Your place is with family," the uncle said, "not wandering about with strangers and guns." Clara didn't move, but John did. He shifted just enough that his shadow loomed larger between them. "She's not wandering," he said, his voice like a stone rolling down a hill. "She made her way here, same as anyone. Seems to me she's earned the right to decide where she belongs." The uncle's eyes flicked to him, narrowing, then back to Clara. "I won't argue in the street. Inside, now." Clara's breath caught, a subtle sound John would have missed if he hadn't spent weeks listening for every change in her voice. She didn't step forward. Instead, she looked at John, just for an instant, as if seeking an anchor. And in that look, he felt the ground shift beneath him. "I'm not going in," she said. The uncle's face hardened. "Don't be foolish, girl. You're a woman alone. What future do you think you'll carve out here?" His hand twitched, not toward her but in a way that carried a promise of control. John's fingers hovered near the butt of his revolver. He didn't draw, not yet, but the unspoken warning in his stance was clear. "She's not alone," he said, calm and steady. For a moment, the air was tight enough to snap. Then the uncle's smile returned, thin and sharp. "I see. A hired gun playing the hero. Very well. But when your coin runs out, Mercer, so will your gallantry. And then she'll see the truth." He turned on his heel and vanished into the boarding house, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was heavier than the fight itself. Clara's shoulders sagged, just slightly, as though the weight she'd been holding slipped at last. She looked at John, her eyes searching his. "He'll never stop," she whispered. "Not until he drags me back." John took off his hat, running a hand through his hair, buying himself a moment. He'd been on plenty of trails where danger followed, but this felt different. This wasn't about bandits or rifles, it was about a choice. His choice. "Then we don't let him," he said simply. Her breath hitched, her lips parting in disbelief. You'd stand against him." He looked at her, really looked, at the strength under her fear, at the fire that refused to be extinguished. I already have. The words hung between them, heavier than any vow he'd ever spoken. Clara blinked, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw tears gleaming in her eyes. Not weakness, relief. She stepped closer, close enough that the dust from her skirts brushed his boots. Why? She asked, her voice trembling. John swallowed hard. The truth had been building inside him since the canyon, since the firelight on her face, since her questions had cracked open the walls he'd built around himself. He had been hired to escort her, but somewhere on the trail, she had become more than a job. More than a passenger. More than he had ever dared to want. Because I can't walk away, he said at last. His voice was rough, unpolished, but true. Not from you. The world seemed to still around them, the noise of wagons, the shouts of townsfolk, even the restless shuffle of horses faded into a distant hum. Clara's breath caught again, but this time her lips curved into the smallest, most fragile smile. I thought, no one would ever stand with me. John's chest ached at the sound of it. He reached out, hesitant at first, then steady, his calloused hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she gripped his hand tightly, as though anchoring herself in him. For a long moment, they stood there on the dusty street, two figures against the world. And in that moment, John understood that his life had shifted forever. He had been a man who walked alone, who lived by coin and by trail, but Clara had become the compass he didn't know he was missing. He wasn't just her escort anymore. He was hers, in a way that went deeper than duty or coin. The sound of the boarding house door creaking open broke the moment. John didn't turn, but his hand tightened around Clara's. He knew her uncle would come again, maybe with lawyers, maybe with men at his back. Trouble was certain, but so was his choice. Clara looked up at him, fear and hope mingling in her eyes. What now? She asked softly. John set his jaw, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the town. Now, he said, we make our own road. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was walking toward danger or running from his past. He felt like he was walking beside her, into something neither of them could escape, and neither of them wanted to.